Welcome to PM Ready, your guide to becoming PMP certified. This is the lesson on closing a project or phase. This lesson covers the close project or phase process, the deliverables of the project and how they flow through the different phases or processes of a project until they reach the end of the project or phase, lessons learned and how they should be handled at each project phase or at the end of the project, as well as exit criteria for phases or the project as a whole, and the final result and final report. Close project or phase is the final process in the integration management knowledge area. It's part of the integration management processes that started at the very beginning with Develop Project Charter, which then moved on to Develop Project Management Plan, the executing processes of Direct and Manage Project Work, as well as Manage Project Knowledge, the monitoring and controlling processes of Monitor and Control Project Work, and Perform Integrated Change Control, and now finally, Close Project or Phase. You'll notice as you look at the process table from the PMBOK guide on page 25 that there is only one closing process, and this is it, close project or phase. It is the process that is responsible for finalizing all of the activities for the project or phase if it's a phase completion. At this point, it takes care of making sure that all planned work has been completed, all useful information has been archived, that all of your project resources are released as needed, and that you closed out your contracts. However, the actual closing out of contracts happens as part of the control procurements process. This is important to remember because it used to be that contracts were closed out as part of the closing process group's close project or phase, but now that has been moved to control procurements to handle the closing out of the contracts. And this process of close project or phase simply ensures that that has been done. The primary outputs of the closing process are the final product, service, or result transition, which is what this project was launched to accomplish, the final report, as well as an updated lessons learned repository. This figure brings information from various locations within the PMBOK guide and brings it all together into one diagram to show you the workflow of how we go from deliverables to the final product, service, or result transition of the project. The Direct and Manage Project Work process is the one and only process that has as its output deliverables. Those deliverables then go to the control quality process where they're compared against the quality requirements for the project. And if they pass those requirements, then they become verified deliverables. They're still the same deliverables, but now they have this qualifier of verified at the beginning of the name, simply to distinguish them from deliverables and indicate that they've passed the control quality process. These verified deliverables then go to the validate scope process, and it's this process that sits down with your key stakeholders, reviews with them the deliverables and the quality report, and shows that they've met the quality requirements, and gets these key stakeholders to accept these deliverables as complete and acceptable. Once this is done, these deliverables are still the same deliverables, but now they have the qualifier of accepted in the name to indicate that those key project stakeholders responsible for acceptance have indeed accepted these deliverables. As these deliverables accumulate and you have finished all of them, then they all go into the close project or phase process and have a new name again applied to them by the close project or phase process. Now they become known as the final product or the final service or the result transition, whatever the final objective is of the project. So when speaking of deliverables in general, it could refer to any of these. But when you're being specific and precise, deliverables have these different names, going from deliverables to verified deliverables to accepted deliverables, and finally to final product, service, or result transition. It's during the close project or phase process that the lessons learned register, which is project specific, containing all those lessons that you've learned during the course of this particular project. It's where all of those lessons from your lessons learned register are then put into the lessons learned repository. You may be selective about this and combine and consolidate a little bit, but those lessons that you feel would be valuable for other projects all need to be put into the lessons learned repository, which is an organizational process asset that is shared by all projects. That way, when new projects are launched, they can start with those lessons from the lessons learned repository as input to the initiation and project planning, especially, of your project. The key points to remember are that the lessons learned register is specifically for your project, that the lessons learned repository is a shared organizational process asset, and that moving lessons learned from the register to the repository happens during this process, close project or phase. You know that the life cycle of a project is that you start with initiating processes, then you move into planning processes, then into executing processes. All of these are monitored and controlled by your monitoring and controlling processes that you can iterate back into planning processes as needed, but that when you're wrapping things up, you move then into your closing processes, which is really just one closing process. But what you need to keep in mind is that this cycle of 5 process groups, initiating, planning, executing, monitoring and controlling, and closing, are also repeated for each phase of a multi-phase project. If you have a project that has 3 phases, then it will go through initiating, planning, executing, monitoring, controlling, and closing 3 times. This means that you'll be reviewing your project charter, and you'll likely have a phase-specific charter as part of your initiating for each phase. That you'll plan each phase in more detail, if needed, at the beginning of each phase. You'll then execute that phase, monitor and control it, and then close that phase. And that as part of closing that phase, you'll be wrapping up the final product, service, or result transition of that phase and putting your lessons learned from your register into the repository at the end of each phase. There are certain things that you should do at the end of each phase or at the end of your project as exit criteria to make sure that you wrap things up cleanly. You might use a checklist to help manage this list and make sure that you have completed all of these items. One is that all of your documents and deliverables are up to date. You should check your issue log and your change log to make sure that all of the issues have been resolved. You should ensure that the deliverables have been delivered to the customer or key stakeholders that should be receiving these, and that they have been formally accepted. This usually requires something in writing. This can be sometimes a bit of a challenge to get, but if you've followed your processes appropriately in your Verify Scope process and ensured acceptance and received that in writing, then making sure that this has been done in your closed project or phase process shouldn't be too difficult. You should make sure that all costs have been charged to the project. This may cause a little bit of a delay in closing the project officially, as these charges come through your system and are reviewed and accepted by you. At which point you should close all of your project accounts to make sure that no new charges hit or are assigned to your project. Now, if you're closing a phase rather than the whole project, you should still make sure that the appropriate phase documents and deliverables are up to date, that phase-specific issues are resolved, that that phase of deliverables has been delivered and formally accepted, that phase-specific charges have been made, and if you're controlling your accounts by phase, that those phase-specific accounts are closed. Also, at the end of your project, you'll need to make sure that personnel have been properly and smoothly reassigned back to the original functional groups or to other projects as needed. That if you have any excess materials left over from your project, that those aren't just left around, but that those are properly handled, disposed of, inventoried, or what have you. That all of your other resources, including facilities and equipment, have also been released and reallocated as necessary back into the resource pool and available for other projects or other operational work. And that if you have any final reports that are needed, that those have been created and distributed. And again, the same goes for a specific phase. If you only needed people for a certain phase, they should be reassigned at the end of the phase. That any excess materials at the end of the phase or other resources are reassigned at the end of the phase if not needed for other phases of the project. And if you do have some phase-specific reports, make sure that those are done before you call the phase complete and close it. Other administrative tasks that are part of closed project or phase include the completion of your contractual agreements, including making sure that you have formal acceptance of the seller's work, that all of your open claims have been finalized and resolved so you have no more open claims, that your records have been updated to reflect your final results. This would include your procurement records especially, and that you have archived any useful information for future use in both your procurement management system as well as in your organizational process assets lessons learned repository. As you close your project or phase, you should also check to see if your project or phase met the appropriate success criteria. And if not, you may want to do some root cause analysis and identify specific lessons learned for why it did or didn't meet project success. You'll want to make sure that you collect all of your project or phase records and that you archive all of this information for future use and wrap up your knowledge sharing and knowledge transfer activities. In closing your project or phase, you'll want to make sure that you transfer the products or results to the next phase of your project or to your operations or production environment. This is often overlooked or underappreciated. You should make sure that you spend the appropriate amount of time in planning for a smooth transition, including meeting with production or operations managers to understand what their needs are in order to be able to take over responsibility for what your project has produced. You should also collect and submit suggestions for improving or updating policies and procedures for your organization in your organization's process assets. And as we covered in stakeholder engagement and project objectives, stakeholder satisfaction should be a key project objective, which you should measure at the end of key phases and at the end of your project. If your project has ended early, then you should take the time to investigate and document why it ended early. And as you do this, make sure that you invite and include all of the appropriate stakeholders to make sure you thoroughly understand why this project had to be ended early, what the root cause was, and what you could learn from this in future projects to avoid a similar situation. As you can see, wrapping up a project or phase properly involves quite a few administrative tasks. The outputs of the close, project, or phase process are primarily the final product, service, or result transition, also the final report, which we'll cover in just a moment. Updates to the lessons learned register. This is applicable if you're closing a phase and you need to update the register with information for future phases. And whether it's at a phase or end of project point, you can update and should update your organizational process assets as needed, including things like your operational and support documents, project or phase closure documents that should be recorded in your lessons learned repository, and other organizational knowledge bases. At the end of your project, or at the end of a major phase, you should generate a final report, which should include a summary level description of the project or the phase if it's a phase level final report. It should indicate what the scope, quality, schedule, and cost objectives were for the project or phase, the criteria that you used to evaluate how well you met those objectives. You should include evidence of whether you've met these, including actuals information and some information about variances and trends, and reasons for any variances should be identified. The validation information for your final product should be included at least at a summary level. And you should indicate whether or not any of the business benefits have been realized by the end of the project, and for those which are met later on and measured some months or years later, you should identify to what degree benefits have been realized so far, to what degree they'll be realized later, and provide a schedule for when and how they should be measured. And this can refer back to the benefits management plan for more details. You should also include a summary of the risks and issues that you've encountered during the project or phase and what you did to address or resolve them. The inputs that you'll need to close your project or phase start off with your accepted deliverables, as well as business documents, specifically the business case and the benefits management plan, plus just about everything else that you've generated for the project: the charter, the management plan, other project documents, agreements and contracts that you have, procurement documentation, and organizational process assets. Tools and techniques include expert judgment, some data analysis in which you can do a bit of regression analysis to relate different variables involved and see how they relate to your project outcomes. You can do some variance analysis to compare how well your project delivered compared to what was originally planned. Trend analysis, not only to view the trends within your project, but also to compare your project to other projects. This may generate some interesting lessons learned that you can analyze along with all of your other lessons learned and include in your organizational process assets lessons learned repository. Doing all of this will, of course, involve some meetings as well. To summarize the inputs, outputs, tools, and techniques of the close, project, or phase process, The inputs are just about everything, all of your plans, project charter, project management plan, all of your project documents, your business documents that were generated before your project charter, plus your accepted deliverables and agreements and procurement documentation. Tools and techniques, there's a relatively short list. Expert judgment, some different types of data analysis that can be useful for other projects, and meetings. And your outputs are your final product, service, or result transition, plus a final report to go along with it, and an update to your organizational process assets. A few key points to remember. You have only one closing process. It applies to the end of each phase as well as at the end of the project, and you should never skip project closure, even and sometimes especially when you terminate a project early. Remember how deliverables flow through the different processes, how lessons learned relate to the organizational process assets, lessons learned repository, that you have some exit criteria that you may want to use a checklist for to make sure you cover them all, that you should include a final report along with your final result, and that your final result needs to be carefully transitioned into operations as needed. For more information, you can refer to these pages of the PMBOK guide. PM Ready is a publication of PM Guaranteed and is based on the Project Management Institute's PMBOK guide.